Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So I am back talking about the Goatman's Bridge or Old Alton Bridge in Denton County, Texas. In this episode, I'm going to get into one of the most popular stories that comes up in urban legends about the bridge. So the story goes that the bridge is nicknamed the Goatman's Bridge because of a pretty horrific story that involves a black man being lynched by the KKK. So consider this your content warning for the episode. Things do get a little bit rough because the history of the area is a little bit rough. Also, I mentioned this in the first episodes of this series, but just a reminder that I grew up in Denton County, where all of the things that I'm going to be talking about took place. This episode is going to be exploring a lot of stuff that I learned about while doing this research for the first time. Even though I'm from Denton County, I just didn't know a lot of the area's history. And it's definitely been, I don't know if eye-opening is the right word, but it's been informative to do all of this research. And I mentioned that I'm from Denton County in part because I get that this sort of history can be hard to hear and hard to grapple with, especially if you're learning about somewhere where you're from. But I think it's really important to better understand local history for many reasons, but related to the interest of this podcast, when researching the paranormal in an area, it's just vital to know the history of that area. And there has been a lot of forgotten history in this area, or more accurately, intentionally hidden history in this area. Oh, also, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the information that I'm using in this episode has come from theses written by students at the University of North Texas. So UNT is a really great university that is in Denton, near where all this is taking place. And there have been several papers written by students there that are on their website that really helped and really seem to be some of the only places where you can find some of this information. So I'll reference the specific pieces, when I'm talking about them, and I'll of course link them in the show notes. But it is worth noting that. And before I get into the story of this urban legend, I wanted to read a quick quote from a student's thesis. So this is a quote that appears in Hauntology Man, which is a thesis by UNT student Adam Michael Wright. And in it, he is interviewing Dr. Sean Treat, who is a former professor at UNT, and he also founded the Denton Haunts Historical Ghost Tour. And Sean Treat is quoting one of his former professors when he says, "Never confuse the facts of a story with the truth of a tale." And I think that's just kind of a perfect summary of the things that I'll be talking about today. So I wanted to start out with that. So let's talk about the most famous story related to the bridge's history, the murder of Oscar Washburn. The story goes that a black man named Oscar Washburn, who was a goat farmer who lived near the bridge, was lynched by the KKK in 1938. Some sources say 1937. Many people have tried to find records confirming that someone named Oscar Washburn lived there, but researchers have not been successful yet. The legend said that Washburn and his family moved into a home a little bit north of the bridge. He was well respected by everyone in the area, and he was seen as a dependable and honest businessman. People nicknamed him the Goatman. On the bridge, he hung a sign that said, "This way to the Goatman." However, local Klansmen saw his success and didn't like that a black businessman was doing well. So in August 1938, Klansmen who held positions in the local government crossed the bridge, driving with their headlights off, I assume to surprise him. They then kidnapped Washburn from his home and hanged him from the Old Alton Bridge. The story goes that when they looked down to make sure that he had died, the noose was empty, and they had no idea what had happened to him. So they panicked, thinking that he had survived and would get revenge. So then they went back to his home and murdered his wife and children. Some stories say that the KKK burned down his house with his wife and children inside to try to bait Washburn into emerging from hiding, if he was hiding, and no one ever saw Washburn again. In many tellings of this story, there's an implication that maybe something paranormal happened that made him disappear from this noose, but it's always phrased pretty vaguely. There's also a local legend that says that if you are descended from clan members and you go to the bridge at night and honk your horn 3 times, the Goatman will appear and get his revenge. Now, like I mentioned in the first episode, there is a trickster element at work in the stories about the Old Alton Bridge hauntings. So, as with every haunting, you shouldn't believe everything you hear about the bridge. And this is an urban legend, people aren't able to substantiate it. If I had to make a guess based on some of the stuff that I'll get into a few episodes from now about rumors about some of these urban legends being faked, I would say that I probably don't think that Oscar Washburn existed, like a historical person named Oscar Washburn who had this happen to him. But before you discount this legend, it's important to understand that Washburn's story isn't the only story of a lynching that happened in that area, which I'll talk about more in the next episode. Whether or not Washburn existed, the KKK had a huge presence in Denton, and they worked to terrorize and destroy Black communities in the area. And it's worth noting, and I'll get really into this later, it's worth noting that the KKK definitely did target successful Black people and did not like the idea of successful Black people in their midst. So, again, with the story of Oscar Washburn, never confuse the facts of a story with the truth of a tale. So, let's talk about the KKK in Denton. For a long time, there has been a narrative that racial violence didn't happen in Denton County. I came across that assertion in several things that I read, and, having grown up there, I didn't hear about any of that. However, recently, some additional information has been unearthed. For this part of the episode, one of my main sources will be a 150-page paper called The Tall Grass West of Town, Racial Violence in Denton County During the Rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. And this is written by Micah Carlson Crittenden, who wrote this as her University of North Texas master's thesis published in May 2020. And I've got a link to the thesis in the show notes. If you find any of this interesting, I strongly recommend that you read this thesis. It's very comprehensive and very good, but of course a difficult read in terms of the content. So here's a little bit from the paper that talks about the myths about there not being racial violence in the area of Denton County. For 6 months, I was told that Denton County was not racially violent and had internalized that belief by fellow students who grew up in the area, Denton County officials, and residents. I believed them when they told me that Denton had both very little slavery and subsequently very little racial strife, because that narrative was so widespread. So, in her research, she would go to find out that there was nearly a 1 in 9 chance of Black Dentonites being arrested, facing violence, or being murdered during the period of 1909 to 1925. So obviously, racial violence was very common in Denton at that time. According to her research, between 1860 and 1880, people in Denton County lynched at least 17 men and 1 young boy, and apparently there are accounts alluding to others without naming the victims' names. The Dallas Morning News published an article about 4 students, including Crittenden, at UNT, who discovered a horrific part of this area's history through all of this research. So these students wanted to research the St. John's community at Pilot Point, which was a place where freed, enslaved people and their families from Alabama and Missouri moved after the Civil War. However, when they were looking at the census records, they saw that between 1910 and 1930, there was a huge decrease in the number of Black people living there. So they set off to find out what had decimated the Black community. They spent months researching it and determined that Black people in the area were intentionally driven away. Some people were scared off, whereas others were likely abducted and lynched. In 1922, Texas had more racial lynchings than any other state. On the other hand, in many other states, the number of lynchings was thought to have started to decline somewhat after 1919. But the KKK was extremely active in Denton, Fort Worth, and Dallas. At first, Denton didn't have its own KKK chapter, but Dallas had Clavern number 66 and Fort Worth had Clavern number 101. Nearby Oak Cliff also had its own chapter, but I couldn't figure out what the number was. And it's likely that some of those chapters included Denton residents, but Denton would later form its own chapter of the Klan, number 136. So let's pause for some brief background on the KKK in the early 20th century. So the first version of the KKK came about around the Civil War during Reconstruction. Its goal was to overthrow Republican state governments, and they did that through violence against Black people and voter intimidation. That version of the KKK was eventually suppressed by the federal government. The second Klan started in Georgia in 1915. If you, like me, have taken a bunch of film classes, then you might remember that the film The Birth of a Nation came out in 1915. The film, which you learn about in film classes because it pioneered a lot of film techniques, is notoriously racist in its depiction of Black people, and it portrays the KKK as heroic and noble. The Birth of a Nation had a huge impact on fanning the flames of white supremacy in the US. To read from Wikipedia, the KKK grew after 1920 and flourished nationwide in the early and mid-1920s, including urban areas of the Midwest and West. Taking inspiration from D.W. Griffith's 1915 silent film The Birth of a Nation, which mythologized the founding of the first Klan, it employed marketing techniques and a popular fraternal organization structure. So, the second version of the KKK was a white supremacist organization, so they hated Black people, but they also disliked Jewish people, Catholics, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants like Italians, Russians, and Lithuanians. They introduced some new ways of intimidating people, such as holding mass parades. They also burned crosses and wore, the famous white robes and pointed hoods, which came from The Birth of a Nation and the book that the film was based on. Supposedly, by the mid-1920s, the Klan had between 3 and 8 million members. Anyway, back to the research that the UNT students did, they found some awful news articles. One 1922 article entitled Prisoners Spirited from Unguarded Jail and printed in the Dallas Express said that 2 Black men who were accused of stealing horses and were subsequently put into the jail were kidnapped. Someone had left an unsigned note on the door of the local newspaper office that said, "Both Negroes got what they had coming. Let this be a warning to all Negro loafers. Negroes get a job or leave town." The article went on to say that 2 additional Black people had disappeared from the jail and hadn't been heard from since. So the students noticed a pattern with articles like this, which was that when Black people were accused of crimes, there would often be intense and sensational articles at the beginning, and then coverage would just suddenly stop. There would be no coverage of a trial, and often the accused people's names weren't mentioned. Black people were being disappeared. They would be accused of a crime, put into jail, kidnapped from jail, and then murdered by the KKK. Crittenden, who, wrote her thesis about this, found that in the 1920s, the KKK and Denton law enforcement formed a partnership to enact racial violence and to cover it up. The sheriff, the city marshal, the county attorney, and the district judge were all members of Clavern 136. Also, in case you're wondering, the alleged crimes would be things like stealing a silver pencil, borrowing a coat, or vagrancy. So, incredibly minor crimes that certainly shouldn't carry a death sentence. And of course, these are folks who did not receive a trial. And we can probably presume that the investigation techniques that led to folks' arrests were not fair. So even if someone wasn't lynched after being arrested, they would often face huge fines, which would require them to work on chain gangs as part of the convict lease system. If that sounds a little bit like slavery, there's a reason for that. There has been a lot of really good and smart stuff written and created about this, but if you want to know more about the topic, you might want to check out the documentary 13th, which is on Netflix and is all about this. Basically about how after slavery was abolished, basically a new form of slavery, was developed. And I've talked about this on prior episodes, but to this day, this is still occurring. So to get back to Denton County in the 1920s, all the stuff I'm describing was a pretty common occurrence during the Jim Crow era. Someone would be accused of a crime, brought to jail, and then the jailer would just happen to not be around when the KKK came to abduct and murder the black victim. There were never any witnesses to these abductions, and of course there was no damage to the doors or the cells, which means that someone entered with a key. They were let in. So, to be clear, the Klan weren't breaking into jails, overpowering jailers, and kidnapping people who had been accused of crimes. No, they were being allowed in, with authorities knowing full well what would happen to these victims. And it's all just, part of the system of Jim Crow justice. There was no investigation and no attempt to solve the murders. So, like I said, the KKK was a huge force in Denton. Around Christmas 1921, the Klan made its first major public appearance in Denton. And this was the first major action by Clavern 136, the Denton chapter of the Klan. One article described the scene thusly. Just before 9 o'clock, over 300 white-robed and hooded figures, headed by a torch of red fire, appeared and paraded the streets for nearly 2 hours. They moved in silence, and the crowd looked on almost as silently. Now, from what I've read, the torch sounds like it was actually a burning cross. They apparently also had a sign that said Denton Klan, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Several thousand people showed up to watch the parade. The researchers at UNT did a review of all mentions of the KKK in Denton newspapers and records between 1917 and 1928. They were mentioned 303 times. They also reviewed all reports of a black person being arrested in Denton County from 1909 and 1925, and they cross-referenced the two lists. Unsurprisingly, they found that Klan violence got worse whenever any kind of crime allegedly involving black people happened, which seems to indicate a close relationship between the KKK and the cops. If you want to know more about this, I'll include links with additional information in the show notes. So obviously the KKK are very relevant to the story of Oscar Washburn and the urban legends surrounding the bridge, but there's also this other element of white people in a community wanting to get rid of black people, and in particular, successful black people. So there's another bit of Denton history that I wanted to cover here as well, because it's relevant to all of this, and that is the story of Quakertown. There's a great article in the Dallas Morning News, which I'll include in the show notes. One of the other big sources that I used for this episode, and in particular for this part of the episode, was a thesis by Chelsea Stallings called Removing the Danger in a Business Way: The History and Memory of Quakertown, Denton, Texas. This was written for her master's at UNT in 2015. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And if you're interested in the topic at all, I recommend that you check it out. It's 132 pages long. It is very comprehensive. And it goes into way, way more detail about all of this than I do. So if you want to see any of the points that I made elaborated on and sourced, etc., just check that out. So back in the early 20th century, there was a bustling community in Denton called Quakertown, which was made up of 80 middle-class black families. There were a few other black neighborhoods, including Peach Orchard Hill, which was 1.5 miles northeast of Denton Square, which is, where the courthouse and everything is in Denton, kind of like the center part of the city, and another community on Egan and Congress Streets, northwest of downtown. But Quakertown was the largest black neighborhood in the area. It had an especially good location, pretty near Denton Square, which was where the businesses and the jobs were. There was also a good school there, the Frederick Douglass Colored School, or Fred Douglass School, which had been established in 1878. The school would later be burned to the ground in 1913, though. It's believed that white arsonists did it. The building didn't have gas or electricity, so there was no reason for it to burn the way that it did. The school was later rebuilt, but at a different location several miles away. Some other good things about the location of Quakertown was that the North Texas region in general had great soil for agriculture and the land was cheap, so good reason to want to live there. And one of the most important things about Quakertown's location was that it was near Pecan Creek, one of the creeks that's off of the Trinity River's Elm Fork. White people probably didn't want to live there because the area tended to flood, so it was an acceptable place for Black people to live. And it was called Quakertown as an homage to Quakers who were abolitionists. Quakertown became the Black community's business district. The population was middle class and doing well financially. Many residents owned their own homes, had jobs, and many of them owned their own businesses. 15 residents had been formerly enslaved, and by 1920, they owned their own homes in Quakertown. A number of residents owned cars. A lot of the streets and sidewalks in the area were paved, and the neighborhood had telephone and electric lines. Folks who lived there wore the latest fashions and had beautiful gardens. As of 1918, Quakertown had a doctor's office, restaurants, a general store, funeral home, a school, barbershop, churches, community organizations, and lodges, etc. So basically, the residents of Quakertown were affluent, they were doing well. But this is the South in the 1920s, and white people were not happy to see prosperous Black people in their midst. To read from Stallings' thesis, this type of Black self-sufficiency existed outside of the white vision, and was most likely the exact reason white Denton began vocalizing disapproval of the Black community in 1920. Among other things, the white vision in the early 20th century stipulated Black dependency on whites. These race relations were tightly controlled with fear and violence in the Jim Crow South. So basically, the point of Jim Crow was to make Black people second-class citizens. This was accomplished through things like ensuring that Black people couldn't participate in politics, stealing Black people's land, setting up a sharecropping system which left people in debt and unable to be self-sufficient, and hate crimes and lynchings, etc. Hate crimes and lynchings were extremely common back then. Stallings writes, recorded numbers indicate that between 1882 and 1968, 3,446 lynchings of African Americans occurred, almost 3 times as many lynchings of whites. An overwhelming majority of the total lynchings, 74%, occurred in states of the former Confederacy, and of those, 86% were Black. Also, of the total lynchings, 59% occurred in the 7 states that make up the Deep South. Of those, 87% were Black. Stallings also writes about how the racial violence against Black people was because Black people were successful. Again, the goal was to keep Black people down. So no one in Quakertown was a sharecropper, but it's likely that many of the Black people in the county, outside of the city of Denton and Quakertown, were sharecroppers. If you know a lot about American history, then when you think of the 1920s, you probably do immediately think of white supremacy, the resurgence of the KKK, and hate crimes, particularly hate crimes targeting middle-class Black people. For example, in recent years, the Tulsa Massacre has become pretty well known, but if you are not familiar with it, in 1921, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in American history occurred. White terrorists burned down 35 blocks of a Black neighborhood called the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroying one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, which had been nicknamed Black Wall Street. Between 75 and 300 people were killed, with 800 people injured. After the attack, 10,000 residents ended up homeless, and many of the survivors left Tulsa. It just completely decimated the entire community. So Tulsa's kind of one of the big famous stories, but of course, this type of violence wasn't unique to the 1920s. So just real quick, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but in 1898, there was a white supremacist coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, which displaced the biracial government in Wilmington. At the time, Wilmington had been a majority Black city, and many of the Black residents were middle-class professionals. So again, sounds a little bit familiar, sounds a little bit like Quakertown. If you want to know more about what happened in Wilmington, there's an excellent book by David Zucchino called Wilmington's Lie that tells that story. It's really good. So what happened right before the 1920s that might have whipped up some white supremacist fervor? Like this was boiling under the surface, but what was going on with the 1920s? Like I mentioned earlier, the second iteration of the KKK was formed in the 19-teens and 20s, and it's not a coincidence that at the same time, local people were doing additional things to further enshrine white supremacist ideology. So, for example, to go back to Denton, in 1918, the Daughters of the Confederacy put up a monument at Denton Square by the courthouse in honor of the Confederate States of America. So that's a large statement of support for the Confederacy, right? Like that's pointed. Also, the Denton Record-Chronicle, the main newspaper in the area, was operated by one Will C. Edwards, who, according to Crittenden's paper, was a Klan candidate for the Texas State House of Representatives in 1922 and was lieutenant governor in 1924. So, as Crittenden points out, because the newspaper was run by a Klan member, it's safe to say that the Denton Record-Chronicle's reporting around this time period should be considered propaganda. The paper repeatedly printed articles mentioning the birth of a nation, literally for years after it was released. In 1917, 2 years after the film's release, Denton's all-white female College of the Industrial Arts, or CIA, which was a block away from Quakertown, screened the birth of a nation on their campus. At the time, the Denton Record-Chronicle reprinted a quote from the Beaumont Enterprise. "This is a time when a glimpse of the past will help us solve the problems of the future. The birth of a nation will inspire noble thoughts and patriotic deeds." So that's pretty blunt and clear. The Denton Record-Chronicle also breathlessly covered the 1919 race riots. To quote Stallings, "The most accessible news source for Dentonites in 1919 painted a picture of violent, aggressive African Americans. These continuous portrayals in the news of victimized white men and militant black men, combined with the glowing editorial reviews of the birth of a nation, contributed to white Denton's perceptions of their own black communities and created racial tension despite the absence of any actual riots in Denton." By 1920, against the backdrop of the resurgence of the KKK, the white residents of Denton had had enough. The residents of Quakertown were doing too well, socially and economically, which was unacceptable to them. So, the white residents of Denton very explicitly and directly employed a number of tactics to intimidate and drive out the black residents of Quakertown. Stallings' thesis describes a white coalition made up of local politicians and their wives, prominent citizens, and members of city clubs and organizations who, quote, "came together to construct a reason to remove the black community out of fear because of its proximity to the white women's college, the College of Industrial Arts." In 1920, the president of the College of Industrial Arts started telling people that they should, quote, "rid the college of the menace of the Negro quarters in close proximity." He proposed the idea at a Rotary Club meeting, and Denton's white leaders decided that they wanted to build a city park there. The entire plan had also been advanced and aided by the local women's club, who had also been involved in the erection of the Confederate monument in Denton Square. The idea was that they had always wanted a park to hold the country fair, but they had just not found the perfect place for it, until finding out that actually Quakertown would be the perfect place. Why didn't they think of that before? Also, Dallas had embraced the City Beautiful urban planning movement, and Dallas had several beautiful parks. So Denton wanted this park so they could better compete with Dallas. But in reality, the most important thing about this new desire for a park was that white people in power didn't like that a bunch of young white women who were living away from home for the first time would be living near a black neighborhood. And to be clear, Quakertown had been around for 40 years. At that point, the College of Industrial Arts had only existed for 20 years. They decided to build the college near Quakertown and then take the residents' land, not the other way around. So in 1921, the government and voters held a bond election to pay for the park project. People who lived in Quakertown were not allowed to vote in that election. To read from Stallings' paper, this time the white coalition was not limited to Denton's powerful and elite. everyday white citizens banded together, ensuring the Black community was relocated to the outskirts of town. Participation from the enlarged white front ranged from simply signing a petition to carrying out KKK violence against the Black community. And here's what the KKK had to say about Quakertown. They contributed $50 to a city charity, and they left a note for the Denton Record Chronicle saying, "The KKK stands for law and order. It stands for the protection of the sanctity of the home and the purity of young girls, college girls who are without the immediate parental guidance." So, again, to read from Stallings' paper, the language of their note, specifically the line of the purity of young girls, evoked the aforementioned racist rhetoric of the birth of a nation and hinted that white womanhood at CIA was compromised by the neighboring Black community. So again, the KKK was very active around this time and did a lot to threaten and intimidate Black residents. Stallings' paper goes into great detail about all of that, so if you want to know more, check that out. The white Dentonites used the bond money to buy property in Quakertown, move people's homes and businesses, or just seize them in order to build the park. Following the seizure of their homes and businesses, the residents of Quakertown were evicted and forcibly moved to Solomon Hill. So, again, per Stallings, this area, which was near an open sewage pit, has been described by local historians as, quote, "a converted cow pasture with no utilities and a severe mosquito problem." So, obviously, that was not a good place to live. So, some former Quakertown residents left Denton altogether. The Civic Center Park opened in the late 1920s in Denton. While Black residents weren't officially banned from the new park that was built where they used to live, they certainly didn't feel welcome to visit. And kind of bizarrely, the story of Quakertown was lost for a time. Kind of a long time. It sounds like the story of Quakertown wasn't really repeated and told among the residents of Solomon Hill. I assume because it was too painful. It is just awful. And of course, the white population of the area forgot about it too. However, in 1989, a cistern containing old bottles and aluminum cans was discovered in Civic Center Park. People wondered what the story was behind the artifacts and who had lived there previously. So local historians and students started researching, and the story of Quakertown emerged. Since then, there have been a number of efforts to memorialize Quakertown, from plaques to renaming Civic Center Park to be called Quakertown Park. If you're from the area and this whole story sounds vaguely familiar, you might be thinking of a book called White Lilacs by Carolyn Meyer. The book calls Denton Dillon and Quakertown Freedomtown, but it's based on what happened in Quakertown. The book was added to middle school curriculum at Denton Middle Schools in 2001. I can't for the life of me remember if I read it when I was younger, but I recognize its old cover, the one from the 1990s, so I've definitely seen it around. So again, my refrain in this episode is never confuse the facts of a story with the truth of a tale. Was Oscar Washburn a real person? I think probably not. However, I think that it's been proven that actually maybe Oscar Washburn never existed, but there were many, many, many Oscar Washburns in the area whose names just were forgotten, right? Like they weren't put in the newspapers, they were quietly disappeared. And knowing the history of Quakertown and the KKK in Denton, you can see why the story about the Klansmen murdering a successful Black man and his family became such a core part of the site's lore. Whether or not that specific story is true, like I said, we know that Black men were kidnapped and murdered by Klansmen, and we know that white residents of the area worked to destroy a thriving Black community precisely because the community was thriving. I've read through many, many comment sections, threads, and reviews of the Old Alton Bridge, and there are always trolls saying that the Oscar Washburn story is made up, and there's often this implication that people shouldn't be telling this tale of racist violence. But the thing is, racist violence did happen in Denton and the surrounding area. While it might be more pleasant for some people to pretend that it didn't happen, random internet trolls' feelings about the matter won't change the facts. So, whether or not Oscar Washburn was a real historical figure, his basic story happened to many people in the area around the Old Alton Bridge. Also, I think it's important to note that, as Crittenden points out in her paper, local newspapers went out of their way to obscure the names of Black people who were kidnapped and lynched in the 1920s. So to me, it's not a huge stretch to think that maybe that could have happened in the 1930s as well. In fact, Crittenden talks in her paper about her search for records of the people who were lynched in Denton County. And to give you a taste of how incomplete records were, here's the process and kind of runaround she went through. So she requested law enforcement records from the city of Pilot Point, but learned that the records had been kept in a room underneath a water tower, and they were destroyed by a water leak. She requested all records from 1865 to 1930 from the Denton County Sheriff's Department, but they said that all the records prior to 1950 had been destroyed because the county wasn't required to keep them. She then asked them for records relating to the destruction of the records and received nothing. She contacted the Pilot Point Post-Signal for issues of the newspaper from the 1920s, but they said that they had no copies of their own newspaper prior to the 1970s. She contacted the Library of Pilot Point and asked for the newspapers from their archives, but the city of Pilot Point said that they had no copies of it from before 1964. She contacted the city of Pilot Point and asked for legal records, and they said that the city might have some copies of tickets from the 1920s in a vault, but the rest of their judicial records were destroyed. She never received any records from the city of Pilot Point. And she drew a parallel between how there were a number of fires on Denton Square in the county's early days, and in the 1920s, the buildings that held the Denton KKK chapter's records were burned down. So yeah, there's a lot of record loss here. And it's not a coincidence that this part of the area's history conveniently vanished for so long. And all of this is why I'm going into such detail here, because, the basic thesis of this podcast is to unearth this sort of history that's been suppressed and hidden. So, while again, I doubt that Oscar Washburn was a real person, there's so much record loss that it does feel possible that folks just couldn't find records of this person because records were destroyed unintentionally or intentionally. So, get back to thinking about the Old Alton Bridge and the stories of the Goatman. To quote Crittenden once more, despite the best efforts of white supremacist sympathizers at containment, the truth leaks out through folklore. Stories like that of the Goatman signal to a violent past without direct indictment of the participants. So all of that was a lot, and I wish I could say, don't worry, next week I'm just talking about ghosts. I promise that the series will get a little bit ghostier and lighthearted later on, but there is some more unpleasant stuff about the area's history that I am going to go into next week. Very interesting stuff that I had not learned in all my years of Texas history class, but, some difficult parts of history. Because, looking at the urban legends, Oscar Washburn isn't the only Black person who was said to be murdered at the site of the Old Alton Bridge. So, next time I will talk about another legendary death at the bridge, this one predating the construction of the bridge, as well as a recent death that happened under somewhat suspicious circumstances. So, until next week, you can check out the show notes at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review, tell your friends about it. And thanks so much for listening.